A few years ago, my husband and I dropped off our oldest son at college for the first time. We went to Walmart and bought him a mini fridge and rug. We hung posters above his bed. And we then drove home and really didn't hear much from Andrew for the first couple weeks. An occasional text asking, how do I do laundry? Or can I have some more money? But basically, we didn't hear anything from him. And then about 2 weeks in, I got a call from Andrew and his voice was breaking. And he said, Mom, someone died in my dorm last night. And then he told me the story. And the story is one that is all too familiar, even if you don't know this particular story and this particular student. The student had been drinking late at night in his dorm room. At around 9 p.m. on a Saturday, he fell and hit his head. His friends watched over him for hours because they wanted him to be okay. So they checked to make sure he was still breathing. They strapped a backpack around his shoulders to prevent him from rolling onto his back and then vomiting and asphyxiating himself. But what they didn't do for 19 hours was call 911. And by the time someone finally made the call, it was too late. His family flew in from out of town and they were with him when the hospital disconnected him from life support. But he died, 19 years old, in his first 2 weeks of college. And when Andrew told me that story, I was just heartbroken because I could just imagine how easily that story could have had a happier ending if one of those kids had picked up the phone and called earlier. Perhaps it would have saved his life. And that led to the start of a new research project, which I'll be describing with you today. And it ultimately led to a book that I've written about this issue of bystander inaction. But I want to say that this, although that particular story was the prompt for this book and the prompt for my talk today, this example of people recognizing somebody in need and failing to step up is universal. And I want to give you some more recent examples that help explain the breadth of inaction. In March of this year, one of my good friends called me and told me a story. My friend has a daughter, Claire, who was adopted from China when she was a baby. Claire is 22, 23 years old, recently graduated from college, and she lives in Boston. So in March of this year, Claire is on a bus heading to work in Boston when a man stood up and said, you should go back to China. You and your people have brought us the coronavirus, and you and your people should go back to China. You know, you're killing Americans. But here's what's most striking about that story. No one on the bus stood up and said for that man to stop. No one said, be quiet. Of course, this young woman didn't bring us the coronavirus. No one even went over and sat with her and consoled her. And that's, again, an example of inaction. Everybody on that bus knew that it was not this young woman's fault that there was the coronavirus pandemic, and yet no one stood up and said anything to support her. And this story plays out all the time. When I saw these images in June of this police officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck, what occurred to me was not this officer. What occurred to me was his fellow officers who sat for 8 minutes and didn't pull their colleague off. And if the other 3 officers had have stepped up and pulled him off, George Floyd would be alive today. And once again, this is an example of bystander inaction. So I want to now ask you all a question. And here's the question. I'm actually going to ask you to use the chat room. And here's my question. Have you ever seen or heard something that you felt was problematic, but failed to speak up? And I'm giving you 3 choices. Yes, that has happened to you. Or no, you've never seen anything problematic. Or no, I've never failed to speak up. So I want you to just write a Y or an N in the chat room. And I'm just going to give you a minute because I've been doing this poll with a bunch of different audiences, and it's frankly fascinating to see. And I want to just give you a sense of what it is. So just write Y or N or yes or no or whatever. And what you can see scanning through is it's yes, 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 Y, yes, yes, yes. A few people, no, I've never failed to step up. And by the way, those people are called moral rebels. And ask me a question at the end, and I'll tell you that example. But if you just scan through this chat room, it's just why. And every time I do this, I do a tally. It's never been not 90% of the people. It's always like 90, 95%. And so as you can see here, this is a very, very universal experience that we've seen something and we haven't exactly known what to do. We haven't had the courage to step up. There are lots of different factors. But the key point here, as you can see in the chat room, is that this is a universal experience of people failing to step up. And it's called the psychology of inaction. And I now want to turn to the why. So why don't people step up? And there basically are three reasons. And some of you actually alluded to this in your answers just now. So one, the perils of ambiguity. Many times we fail to speak up because we see something, but we're not exactly sure what we're seeing. And here's a classic example. This is a picture taken from a video feed at a mall in the United Kingdom. A little boy, the small figure on the left-hand side of your screen, was shopping with his mom in a crowded mall one day when he became separated. They looked everywhere for him. They couldn't find him. And 2 days later, they found the little boy's body. He'd been beaten to death and left beside some railroad tracks. So they went back, they looked through the mall footage, and they found these images. And they could see very clearly that he was being taken away by two older boys. Now, little Jamie, the 2-year-old, is screaming. He's like, "Let me go, leave me alone." And the mall was crowded, as you can see in this image. So lots of people saw what was happening, and yet no one called the police. Because here's the challenge. We've all seen a 2-year-old having a fit in a shopping mall before. It's not a situation that cries out emergency. And so people saw it, but they didn't know that it was an emergency, and so no one stopped to help. And this situation happens time and time again. In a classic illustration of this, a number of years ago, researchers testing this idea of ambiguity did something very clever. They brought in students, they put them in a room, a small room alone, to fill out a survey. And as they started filling out the survey, smoke started pouring into the room. Now, if you're alone and smoke starts pouring in, guess what you do? You stand up and you go get help, because we understand smoke, it means fire. But here's the challenge. When we're not alone, it actually becomes much harder to know what to do. So in another situation, they hired 2 accomplices, friends of the researcher, and they told these people, no matter what happens, do not do anything. Do not react. Just stay quiet, no matter what. So you're sitting there, you're filling out the survey. All of a sudden, smoke starts pouring into the room. So you look up because you look at the other people. And again, they're not reacting at all. And they wanted to see, what do people do? Remember, if you're alone, everyone gets up and leaves. But if you're with 2 other people who don't respond at all, most people just sit there and continue to fill out the survey. And in this study, they let the smoke continue to pour in for 6 minutes. And it was getting thicker and thicker and thicker. People were having to wave it away. And yet, most people stayed in this room for 6 minutes, because when they looked to the other 2 people, they didn't react. They just kept filling out their survey. So the study finally ends, and the researcher then says, did you notice the smoke? And everybody notices the smoke. Everybody absolutely noticed the smoke. And then they say, what'd you think it was? And they have all sorts of non-emergency explanations. I thought it was an air conditioning vent malfunctioning. I thought you were pumping truth serum into the room. They have all sorts of non-emergency explanations that explain their inaction. And that's the challenge, that if you're in a group setting, you look to other people's behavior. But if everyone is looking to everyone else's behavior to figure out how to react, no one may actually step up and get the person the help that they need. And that's an example of the perils of ambiguity. When a situation is ambiguous, we look to other people, but if they're not reacting, we assume that they must have different knowledge than we have. And this finding is clear in another example that occurs all the time in daily life. And I want to share that with you now. Many of us remember a time being in a college classroom in which the professor says, "Do you have any questions?" And you had a question, but you chose not to raise your hand. And you choose not to raise your hand because you don't want to look stupid. But here's what's fascinating. You know exactly why you don't want to raise your hand, because you have a question, but then you look around at everybody else and no one else seems to have a question. So you decide your question must be stupid because surely you're the only one with a question. But here's what's fascinating. When you look at all these other people also not raising their hands, you don't think, oh, they don't want to look stupid. No, you think these people aren't raising their hands because they're smart. They don't have any questions at all. And that's an example in which, again, your behavior, not raising your hand, is exactly the same as everybody else's behavior, not raising their hand. But you assume your behavior is driven by something entirely different. You don't want to look stupid. Other people are just very smart. They have no questions. So one explanation for the psychology of inaction is that we don't know what's going on. And that makes it actually very hard to step up. We don't want to look foolish or feel embarrassed or overreact. But in other situations, we know exactly what's going on. And we know that it's an emergency, but we don't feel responsible for helping. And this also can lead people to not speak up in all kinds of different circumstances. Many of you probably recognize this picture. These images were taken from a United Airlines plane a few years ago. This man, the flight was overbooked. Security officers boarded the plane and dragged this man down the aisle. They injured his nose. I think he lost a tooth. I mean, it was really awful. And here's what's fascinating. There's an entire plane full of people. And in fact, it's very clear that there was a plane full of people who all thought it was really problematic. And that's why we know that this happened. Because in fact, people saw what was happening and they took out their phones and they started recording because they were like, this is terrible. And as soon as they got off the plane, they uploaded these images, and that's why you know these images and you probably know this story. But here's what no one on the plane did. No one on the plane stood up and said, hey, stop this, stop doing what you're doing, let that man alone, etc. No one on the plane actually stood up and did anything. And that, again, is an example of the perils of ambiguity. Not ambiguity in this situation, it's about responsibility. And so in other situations, even if they're not ambiguous, we don't feel responsible to help if we're in a group setting. Now, many of you may remember hearing about the story of Kitty Genovese. This story occurred a number of years ago in New York City and was widely described at the time as a group of people stood by and late at night while this young woman was getting stabbed, they failed to speak up. They failed to go down and help her. They heard her scream, and no one even called the police. That was how the story was described at the time. Now, it kind of appears that was misreported at the time, that in fact, some people did call the police. Somebody went down and was with her when she died. But that real world example actually led to a series of studies that were done by psychologists on what we know as the bystander effect or bystander intervention. And what research on the bystander effect or bystander intervention shows is that in group settings, even when we recognize that there's something problematic, people don't feel compelled to step up because they can say, well, I don't have to. Somebody else can do so instead. So in situations like these, even if we recognize that there's an emergency, it's not ambiguous, we don't feel compelled to step up if there are other people with us and we think, well, you know what? They could help. I don't have to be the one to step up. Another study was done, again, on the same topic a number of years ago. They brought in college students, put them in private rooms where they could, in theory, discuss private issues that college students had. So they were put in private rooms as a way of giving them confidentiality. And they were told, you'll just communicate with the other students through these intercoms. So you're in these private rooms and you're going to have this conversation with these other students. One of the students during the introduction says, I just want to tell everybody my name is John and I actually have a seizure disorder. And sometimes when I'm in a really small room, it brings out episodes of a seizure. So if you notice that I'm slurring my words or I'm not responding, it's really important for you to immediately go and get help, because I actually really could be in trouble. And that's really an important thing for people to get prompt help. So now, in one condition, everybody could hear John, that everybody believed that you could hear John, this person who might have a seizure. But in another condition, they skewed it and they told one person in particular, hey, John's intercom is malfunctioning. And so the only person who can hear John is you. So it's really important that whatever John says, you communicate to the rest of the group, because his intercom is not working and you're the only one who can hear it. Okay, so that's the setup. In one condition, everybody can hear John. And in the other condition, you're the only person who can hear John. So the study starts, and as you can imagine, John starts slurring his words, having a seizure. And the question is, who stands up and goes and gets help? Now, in what is a little bit disturbing, 85% of people who believe they're the only person who can hear John immediately go and get help. So that's good in that it's 85% of people, but it also certainly begs the question of who are that 15% of people that are like, I think I'll just sit here and I won't actually get help. So that is a real challenge in terms of why are they not, in fact, going to get help. 15% of people don't, but 85% do, and that's a great thing. But if people believe that everyone, in fact, can hear John, most people don't go to get help. Most people, if they believe, well, all the other 5 students can hear John, I don't have to go get help. In fact, most people don't actually stand up and go help him, even though it's another student who's apparently having a seizure. And this is an example that occurs all the time. In group settings, individuals start to slack off and not actually help. This is a phenomenon that psychologists often describe as social loafing. Social loafing. And this phenomenon happens in many daily life situations. High school and college students often don't like group projects because they're worried, oh, I'm going to have to do more than my fair share of the work, and that's going to be, disadvantageous to me. That's an example. And so each individual person sort of slacks off, not wanting to be the sucker. But it's also why restaurants often impose a mandatory tipping rate to make sure that waiters and waitresses get an appropriate amount of a tip, because in group settings, people often kind of are a little bit cheap and don't contribute their fair share. So the next condition that clearly matters is that if we're in a group setting, each individual person doesn't step up and help. But I now want to turn to the third issue, and that is that there can be costs of helping. That even in conditions in which it's not ambiguous and there are no costs and there's clearly our responsibility, we can face considerable costs. And that can be really problematic. And I want to tell you about a few of these. One, we can worry about our personal safety. You may or may not recognize these 3 young men, but they were on a train in Portland, Oregon, when all of a sudden a man stood up and started yelling racist slurs at a Black young woman and a Muslim woman who was wearing a hijab. The man started yelling racist slurs at them, and these 3 men did the right thing. They stood up and they told that man to stop yelling the racist slurs. But that man had a knife, and he stood up and started stabbing them. So there's a case in which they were rightfully concerned about their safety. They stepped up anyway, but it had really serious consequences. But in other cases, we aren't worried about the physical safety. We're worried about other kinds of costs, such as professional costs. This point was brought home to me a number of years ago. I had an internship in college with a doctor. One day we were driving to a meeting. He was going to present at the meeting, so he was driving the car. He couldn't find a place, and the parking lot was very crowded. So he pulled into and parked on a handicap slot. And this man was perfectly abled. He did not need a handicap space. So I knew it was wrong, and we got out of the car, and I sort of looked at the sign and looked at him, and he looked at me and smirked, and then he started limping over to the building. So I knew it was bad. I knew it was a bad idea. I knew it was not fair to a potentially handicapped person who would need that space, while we were at the meeting. And yet I didn't say anything because I was worried about needing a letter of recommendation. I was worried about my own, future in terms of this person liking me, hiring me, recommending me, and I didn't say anything. And that happens in many cases, that we worry about the professional costs of calling out bad behavior. After the Harvey Weinstein thing came out, it was clear that many, many people had known what was going on for a long time. Longtime collaborator, Quentin Tarantino, was interviewed by the New York Times a couple years ago. And they asked him the question that I think is probably on many people's minds. Did you know what was going on? And what he said was, I knew enough to do more than I did. And of course, what Quentin Tarantino did was nothing. So yes, he could have done more than he did. But many people didn't want to call out Quentin Tarantino's bad behavior. Harvey Weinstein's bad behavior, because he was making and breaking careers. He was hiring people. He was firing people. He was getting people Oscars. And so Quentin Tarantino and lots of other people stayed silent for years. And of course, many of us in the New England area remember the Spotlight story by the Boston Globe Spotlight team that conveyed the extent of sexual abuse that had gone on by members of the Catholic clergy for years. And they simply passed these priests from parish to parish, and many additional kids were abused because of that. But people worried about the professional costs of calling out the Catholic Church in Boston. And of course, we've seen similar stories all across the world. And finally, we worry about the personal costs. We worry about calling out bad behavior because we worry about offending our family members or friends or teammates or fraternity brothers or so on. And so in many cases, we worry about speaking up to bad behavior because people won't like us, we won't fit in. This is a picture of a young man, Tim Piazza, who died in a fraternity house at Penn State University. And the story is very similar to the one that I told you at the start today about the student who died in my son's dorm. Tim had been drinking late at night. During a fraternity hazing event, he fell down a flight of stairs. His fraternity brothers carried him up, put him on a sofa, and they watched his abdomen turn purple as it was filling with blood. And yet, no one called the police for just about 19 hours because they worried that they would get in trouble. They worried that other people in the fraternity wouldn't like them. And as a result, Tim Piazza died, 19 years old. And what research in neuroscience now tells us is that rejection actually feels bad in the brain, that people process rejection in the same way that they process physical pain. They've brought in people to the lab, they've exposed them to a task in which they are ostracized. So two people are throwing a ball back and forth, and then they exclude one of the people from this ball throwing game. And when you have that experience of being ostracized, excluded, while you're in an fMRI machine that's examining brain patterns of brain activation, what it shows is that it activates the exact same part of the brain that is activated when you spill hot coffee on your arm or stub your toe. It's literally a part of the brain that processes physical pain, and it feels terrible. And that's a reason why overwhelmingly people again and again and again try to avoid being rejected, because it feels literally like physical pain. So I've described so far all of the different evidence in terms of why people fail to speak up. And I now want to turn and ask you another poll question. If you've ever failed to speak up, what was the primary cause? Is it ambiguity? Is it feeling like it wasn't your responsibility? Or is it fear of the consequences? So just percolate on that for a second. And I'll return to this at the very end. But the key is that in most cases, when we fail to speak up, it's one of these three factors. We don't really know what's happening. We know what's happening, but we don't take responsibility, or we worry about the consequences. And all of those factors can play a major role in terms of leading us to be inactive in different situations. But I now want to turn to what we can do, because the reason why I love giving this talk is I'm really hoping that it's going to give people strategies that they can use in all kinds of different situations. And I want to share with you another picture. Some of you may recognize this image. It's of a little girl, Elizabeth Smart. When she was 14, she was kidnapped from her home in Utah. And there was no sign of her for nearly 9 months. And then one day, a husband and wife were shopping in a small town in Utah when they recognized three figures, a man and a woman and a younger woman. And the women were covered almost from head to toe. They had cloth robes over their heads. Most of their faces were covered. And yet the man said, "Boy, doesn't that girl kind of look like Elizabeth Smart?" And the wife said, I don't know, maybe. What do you think?" And he said, "I don't know. Why don't we just call?" So he picked up the phone, he called the police, and then didn't think anything about it. And later that night, he caught a call from the police. And what they learned was that that call actually led to her rescue. And she's probably not alive today if he doesn't make that call. So that story illustrates the power that one person making a call, stepping up, not staying silent, can really make a huge difference in all kinds of situations. And I am reminded, I think, especially these days, about a wonderful quote by Martin Luther King Jr. And here's the quote: "History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people." And my belief ultimately is that most people are good people, but very normal psychological factors lead most of us to stay silent in all kinds of situations. And what research shows is that understanding the psychology that leads us to stay silent can actually give us the courage to speak up in all kinds of situations. And I now want to turn and talk about some specific strategies that we can use in different situations to step up and be courageous. First, we need training, and we need to kind of practice so that when the situation arises, we know what to do and we have a plan. These three men were on a train in France when a man stood up with an assault rifle and started firing. And these three men, these three Americans, jumped him, pulled the gun away, and no one on the train died. So what did they have in common? Well, two of these three men had actually been in the military. They had served in the Army Reserves. And so they actually had gone through some training that gave them the courage to be able to speak up in this kind of tremendously dangerous situation. And this is, of course, this theory behind training and practice. This is the theory by which many people get CPR trained. And if you get CPR certified, you have to redo it every year or two. And that's because they want people to be able to put it into action at the given time. And that's why it's so important to think ahead. How would you do something before you're in that moment? Many of us have been in a situation in which we see or hear something problematic and we don't really know what to do. And then like 2 days later in the shower, we're like, oh, I know what I should have said, but that's too late. So you need to kind of think ahead. What would you say? And you need to practice that response. So if you're in that situation, you can kind of step up. And all kinds of daily life experience can give us comfort in knowing how to step up. This point was brought home to me when I was a senior in college. I was at Stanford out in California, and I was on the 4th floor of a building in October of 1989 when there was a major earthquake, the Loma Prieta earthquake, some of you might remember. So the building is swaying back and forth. It led to tremendous damage all around Northern California, the collapse of a bridge right by San Francisco, as you see in the image. And I remember it vividly. All of the students in the class looked up at the professor and, we were like, what should we do? And I remember it vividly. She grabbed the edge of the table and she looked at all of us and she says, "I'm from New York." And of course, what she's saying is, I don't know what to do. But a kid in the class stood up and he goes, I'm from California. Get under the table. And that's an example of just his life experience of having been in California led him to know what to do in that kind of an emergency. So training, practice in daily life, thinking ahead, all of that can help give us the courage to stand up and say something in particular situations. 2, foster empathy. It's much easier to step up and do something if you can put yourself in somebody else's shoes. If we can imagine, well, what if it was my daughter on the bus in Boston who was being attacked with anti-Asian slurs by a man? What if it was my son who was lying on a bed in a college dormitory and was, going in and out of consciousness? Fostering empathy, putting us in somebody else's shoes, can give us the courage to step up in all kinds of situations. As the wonderful quote about the poem about the Holocaust says, in Germany, first they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I did not speak out because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. And that's an example, again, of this importance of putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes. Oprah did a wonderful feature for her magazine a couple of years ago, which was designed to help people try to think about how it would be looking at the world from a different perspective. And I want to share with you a couple images from this. So imagine how it would be if you were a little girl in a store in which none of the dolls looked like you. How would that feel? Imagine if the people giving the pedicure and the people getting the pedicure were flipped in terms of our typical stereotypes. And these are examples of ways of trying deliberately to think about the world through someone else's perspective. And that can have a powerful impact on our ability to see the world in somebody else's shoes and step up. We know that ethical leaders matter. Ethical leaders matter in all kinds of situations. We look to the leaders to guide us. There's a wonderful book, if you're looking for some pandemic reading, about the Holocaust. And it describes a village in France that during Nazi Germany had hid 1,500 Jewish men, women, and children. And every time the Nazis came through, they said, no, we don't have any Jews here. And the people in the town hid Jewish people. They didn't turn over anyone, unlike all of the other villages in France. Why? Well, there was a minister in this town, and the minister said, God loves the Jewish people just like he loves the Christian people, and we're going to hide them. We're not going to turn them over to be killed. And leaders of all types can make a difference. Early in my time at Amherst College, I had a group of football players in my class who never spoke up at all. And it was really irritating me and setting a bad model for other students. So I emailed the head football coach and I said, can you help me out? And he said, give me their names. And about a minute later, he sent an email out to those 5 guys and said, anyone who doesn't speak in Professor Sanderson's class doesn't play on Saturday. And that problem took care of itself right away. We saw in June of this year, the following tweet by a young man named Kylan Hill. And here's his tweet. Either change the flag or I won't be representing this state anymore, 100%. And I meant that. I'm tired. And he tagged the governor of Mississippi. And that tweet was the start of a movement to get rid of the Mississippi state flag that had the Confederate flag on it. And that's an example of leadership. Leadership can take all forms. We also know that sometimes it's hard to be brave alone. Having a friend with you can help you give you courage. These 4 young men integrated the Greensboro, North Carolina lunch counter. They faced taunts from the KKK outside. They worried about their physical safety, but they were friends and roommates, and they did it together. 2 whistleblowers called the authorities and reported the fraudulent behavior that was happening at the blood doping company Theranos. And that call led to the downfall of what was basically a Ponzi scheme, depriving many people of millions of dollars. These 2 young men were Swedish graduate students biking across the Stanford University campus when they came across a man sexually assaulting an unconscious woman. And they pulled him off and called the police. These are all examples about how we can have more courage if we find a friend. And ultimately, the reason why I love talking about this topic is that by helping people understand the psychology of inaction, we can all start to be a little braver and speak up in all kinds of different situations. And ultimately, we could change the culture. My daughter, Caroline, was born on May 17th, 2004, which is a historic date in the United States because it's actually the day at which Massachusetts became the first state to legalize gay marriage. And 11 years later, Caroline and I were in the car when the Supreme Court issued its landmark decision legalizing gay marriage across the country. And when that decision came down, I said to Caroline, I can't believe it that 11 years ago you were born and gay marriage was allowed only in Massachusetts and now it's allowed everywhere. And Caroline looked up and said, yes, what took so long? And I said, that's not long, but that's an example about how quickly our culture can change once we reach a tipping point. So how do we reach the tipping point? By changing social norms, by changing bit by bit what other people are doing. And I want to give you a classic example. This was a study that was done by psychologists in hotel rooms. Half the people got a little message like this: save the planet, conserve water, reuse your towels and sheets. This is really important to save Mother Earth. The other half of people got a similar plaque, but first it said, 85% of hotel guests care about Mother Earth, so they reuse their towels and sheets. All right, so there's an example in which there are two messages. They say basically the same thing, but one of them says 85% of hotel guests already do this. And what they found was that people don't really care about Mother Earth, but they very much care that other people care about Mother Earth. That plaque was more effective. More recently, and this is a timely example, political scientists at Yale sent out messages designed to increase voting to actual households in Michigan. Some people got a message that said, please vote. Some people got a message that said voting is an American right. Some people said voting is, important part of being a democracy. And some people got a message that said, most of your neighbors vote. And what they found was that message, most of your neighbors vote, was the most effective at increasing rates of voter turnout. So we can all change the culture to one in which speaking up, calling out bad behavior, stepping up for someone in need becomes what's normal and not what's rare. And I want to leave you with one final quote by John Steinbeck from East of Eden that really describes the choice that all of us can make. Humans are caught in their lives, in their thoughts, in their hungers and ambitions, in their avarice and cruelty, and in their kindness and generosity too, in a net of good and evil. A man, after he has brushed off the dust and chips of his life, will have left only the hard, clean questions. Was it good or was it evil? Have I done well or ill? And ultimately, I'm hoping that hearing this talk will give people strategies they can use so that when it comes time to ask that question, you can say, I did good, I did well. And we're now going to turn to Q&A, which I love. But I want to say at the outset that if anybody would like a copy of this entire slide deck, you can shoot me an email. My email's on the screen. I'm also on Instagram regularly talking about this topic and other things that I do research on. If you're on social media, I have a website in which you can also see other versions of talks that I've given. And for anyone who's looking for some pandemic reading, this is the book that I've written that came out earlier this year that examines lots of the details and strategies and the research I've described here. And it is available for reserve at the Brattleboro Library. And I'm encouraging everyone who wants to read it, check it out from your library, your local library, or try to purchase it from your local independent bookstore. This is a really crunch time for independent bookstores. So if you have a local bookstore, try to support them. And I also am glad to answer questions now. If you have a question that you don't want to put in the chat room, it's also fine to send me a private email and I will respond that way. So thank you so much for listening. And I think we're going to do questions, tests from the chat room. So I'm going to read aloud questions and I will be glad to again answer any questions. So please type in anything and thank you so much. So I think the first question that I see is it can be a question of taking personal responsibility for what's happening. And that's absolutely true, that one of the keys is that in a group setting, each individual person may not feel responsible. And so that people who have some position of authority in a setting, it could be, a leader, a president, a teacher, or whatever, captain, may feel more responsibility for helping. So leadership matters. Leadership, of course, can also model helping in different situations. One question, and thank you so much for this one. Can you speak a little about moral rebels? So as my book title describes, what I'm trying to do is basically shift people from being the sort of more typical bystander into being what I call a moral rebel. And basically what moral rebels are people who seem to not fall prey to the normal tendency to stay silent. At the very beginning today, I had people put in the chat room, yes or no or whatever. And a few people always say, no, I always speak up. I'm always the one. And so what do we know about moral rebels? So there are a couple things. One, moral rebels share some specific traits. One, they tend to be high in empathy. I've talked a lot about empathy, and they do tend to be high in empathy. And so that's one factor, that they find it very easy to put themselves in somebody else's shoes. Two, moral rebels also tend to not really care about what people think about them. So they're much more willing to sort of speak up and risk embarrassment or feeling awkward. That, in fact, can be, very, very effective. But the other thing that we see about moral rebels, and I take a lot of solace and comfort in this as one with an argumentative 16-year-old daughter, children who argue with their parents seem to be better at standing up to peer pressure. And what the researchers think is that you get kind of practice fighting it out with mom and dad, and that gives you the strength to be able to speak up when your peers maybe are doing something bad. So the important thing to remember is that there are people who are moral rebels. I actually talk about those traits in more detail in chapter 9 of this book. But even if you're not naturally a moral rebel, there are things that we all can do to develop our inner moral rebel. And that's actually what I talked about in the last half of my talk today, and what I talk about in chapter 10 of this book. Okay, next question. Are there techniques and phrases to help one feel more brave and get others to join you to become friends and lean in with you to do the right thing? Absolutely. Love that question. And basically, I don't think there's one size fits all. So, I mean, obviously, I've talked about a lot of different situations, and the kind of skill that you need if somebody says something, racist in the workplace or homophobic in the locker room, or there's a person, getting abused on a, tormented on a subway train or whatever. Those are different kinds of situations. So I don't think it's one size fits all. But I think what's important is for people to think before they're in that situation whenever possible, so that you have sort of a repertoire of things. So maybe if you've noticed a kind of pattern that's happening at the office, maybe you could talk to a colleague or friend, hey, have you noticed this thing I'm seeing? And that's about getting a friend. Or maybe you could come up with a set of comments or remarks, etc. Somebody actually had another one. Are there techniques or phrases that help you become one? And somebody had said, what about using humor? So actually, humor, I think, is a great one. And for anyone who's really interested in this topic, I actually published a piece last week. If you Google it, it'll come up, but it's like 6 tips for speaking up or something like that. Or you can email me and I'll give it to you, but it'll come up pretty quickly if you email, if you Google search Catherine Sanderson, and it was published by something called the Greater Good Company. And I actually go through those. Humor is a great one. So you could say, for example, I know that you're just joking when you say a woman is too emotional to be president, but you shouldn't say it because, of course, some people believe that. So there's an example. But you can also just kind of express surprise. What do you mean by that? Or can you say more about that? There are other ways in which you can actually kind of call out the behavior. One of the ways that I think is most important is trying to find a way to call out behavior that doesn't make the other person feel stupid or bad. And so sometimes if somebody says something that's, offensive, you might be able to say, you know what, I used to think that too, or I used to feel that way, and then I learned. Or you can also take ownership of it. Like, I know that you didn't mean anything by it, but, my mom, actually, whatever. So, or, my sister is actually, and so trying to personalize it, trying to make it about you, not them. So again, it's not a one size fits all solution, but the key is that when you stay silent and you don't say anything, it implies that you agree with it. And that's what's so important. Okay, what about overdoing, speaking up, ganging up behavior, too many telling someone in store to wear a mask? Well, I mean, so I think that the research that I'm talking about here really describes people being inhibited and not speaking up. So if there are cases in which a lot of people are speaking up, that's actually not something that I cope with in my book. So my book is focused on the pressures that sort of lead people to stay silent in that situation. And I'm looking at the psychology of inaction, not the psychology of too much action, which there probably is somebody else doing a book about that. How does this talk relate to our current political situation, meaning the way our current president speaks about people who are not in his camp? So as you can probably imagine, I get a lot of political questions these days. And what I will say is that I think empathy is really important. And I think that it would be great if President Trump showed more empathy. And I think that many of us would be well served by thinking about the world from somebody else's perspective. And I think when we talk about sort of an us versus them, it actually leads people, as I think this question implies, it leads people to feel much less obligated to help. There's research I describe in this book that shows simply believing that you share the same sports fan allegiance with somebody else increases your ability to help. So if you are a Red Sox fan and you see a Red Sox fan in need, somebody with like a Red Sox t-shirt on, you're more likely to help that person than if like you're a Red Sox fan and you see another person with a Yankee shirt on. And that they've literally done that study. So it doesn't have to be some deep allegiance like it's your, family member or your friend or, whatever. It can literally be, we both like the Cubs or whatever. And so that's a great question. Let's see. What about power? For example, if I'm white, why would I intervene to defend a Black person being threatened and go against my own power supremacist interest? Well, I mean, what I'd say is that we all benefit from a world in which bad behavior doesn't happen. And as a woman, I benefit from women not being treated poorly, but I also benefit from men not being treated poorly. As a white person, I benefit from people in general, even if they're not white, being treated fairly. I think most of us saw the images of George Floyd's death and of course, countless other men and women. And even if we are not people of color, those images might have horrified us. And we might think, gosh, if that were my son, my husband, my brother, my sister, whatever, that would be tragic. And I actually think for people who are in more powerful positions, there's almost a special responsibility that you have of being able to speak up so that all the work of correcting microaggressions and calling out bad behavior doesn't fall on people who have to kind of go through life experiencing that again and again. And I'll also say that what happens in many cases, and people describe this in lots of different environments, is that something bad will happen, let's say in a meeting or in a locker room. And the person who it happened to gets lots of private support. So later people saying, yeah, I thought that was really terrible what that person said, or that was a really rude comment, but people don't call out the behavior at the time. And so what I think is actually really important is for us not to give private support if there's somebody who is in need, but actually to give public support and deliberate support. Next question is, remember the men on Flight 93 on 9/11 who tried to take on the hijackers? And yeah, that's a great example of people stepping up and trying to do something in that way. And so sad, of course, that it was not successful. And somebody said I'm a moral rebel, and hey, that's good. Overwhelmingly, that we need more of them. Oh, and Tess has actually put in the chat. Thank you so much, Tess. So if you go in the chat room, you can actually see the article that I referred to, which is 6 tips for speaking up against bad behavior. That's lots of the stuff that I've talked about here, but it's all taken from the last chapter of my book. Next question. It is so rare to encounter a personal individual incident such as you mentioned. What about larger issues which exist outside of your proximity, e.g. climate change? The individual is so powerless against big national polluters. So let me say a couple things about that. I don't think it's rare. I really don't think it's rare. I think that many of us see situations all the time in which we see some kind of problematic behavior. I don't think it's rare. I think things like the Holocaust are rare, or looking at George Floyd's death is rare. But I think many of us are in situations all the time in which we see bullying, we see sexual harassment, we see problematic behavior, and we fail to speak up. And I actually think that this has lots of implications for things like, in fact, supporting climate change. In fact, I was interviewed on a podcast and maybe April or so, specifically because they actually saw the relevance of this. Because a lot of the work that I've done and that I talk about in this book is actually on shifting social norms. And so to the extent that we can shift social norms about what is and is not acceptable in terms of climate change or policies, that's about shifting social norms. I'm old enough, I don't know how old everybody is who's listening to me, but I'm old enough that I remember where you could buy a plane ticket in the smoking or non-smoking section. And when I tell my college students that, they're like, what do you mean? What do you mean? I grew up at a time in which people didn't really wear seatbelts. People didn't really wear bicycle helmets. And those are all examples of how social norms have changed. And my book examines how social norms change. So if the norm that you're interested in is climate change or gun control or whatever, all the evidence is that norms change in the exact same way. And so, yeah, these same strategies that I've described actually can shift norms about climate change or any political topic that you care about. The process is exactly the same. And that's what's important. In fact, I'm interviewed literally today in an article by in USA Today that looks at gender differences in wearing masks. And I talk about the sort of social norms and influence process of that. So again, this issue of social norms and what do? It applies to virtually all aspects of our lives. Next question. Oh yeah, there's a fragment above that I lost a question. So there are acute situations where you go with the seat of the pants impressions, and then there are long game situations like how to address global warming or political drone assassinations or xenophobic policies. The quality of your thought and understanding becomes key in those situations than how you act on your understanding. Yeah, and that's absolutely true. So again, understanding, developing your beliefs, gaining a knowledge set, all of that's important. The challenge is that there are many cases in which people have that knowledge set and they understand it and they still fail to speak up because they still say, well, what if people don't like me? What if I, say something that's controversial? What if I get attacked for it? And so, yeah, I think that having the knowledge basis is essential, but lots of times people still stay silent and don't actually speak up in all kinds of different situations. And the acting is important. If you don't adequately take on the abuser, one can go on to the victim and take care of her. Yeah, and I love that comment. So, and that's an example, I think that's Judith Theringer typed that in. Thank you for that. And I think that's a really great example of on the bus, you didn't have to have somebody stand up and be like, shut up, or you're awful. Somebody could have just gone over to that young woman and said, hey, what are you doing this weekend? How are you? And so what I think is important, and let me be very clear, I don't think that the point of my talk and my book is in every moment you have to, step up and you have to be the hero. I think it means they're just small moments in which we could step up and we could be kinder. Tess has again very thoughtfully put in the USA Today article that I was interviewed by today. And I want to just give you one more example. I was in the Atlanta airport a couple of years ago, back when people used to fly, and I was in the sort of underground tram area. And I was on my phone and I was just, walking from, terminal to terminal underground when I saw a couple standing beside a trash can, and the man was vomiting profusely into the trash can. So I'm on the phone and I'm just talking. I walk past them and I was like, that's maybe the kind of thing that I should do something about. And so I hung up the phone, I walked back and I just said, hey, may I help you, to the woman? And she said, well, my husband is just really sick. And I said, yes, I can see that. And may I help you? And she said, yeah, actually, could you go get a wheelchair? And I said, absolutely, I would go do that. So here's the thing. I'm not a doctor. I don't work at the airport. There were tons of people all around. And it would have been very easy for me to just keep walk right on by and stay on my phone. But I didn't. And I think the world is better if people stop and say something and try to help when they can, even in some small way. I grocery shop for a high-risk woman in my neighborhood, and every once in a while she'll make an off-color statement when we are speaking on the phone. I usually just change the topic to avoid conflict. Is that okay? So here's the reality. Many of us do that all the time. A student was in my office about a year ago, and he said, and the student is on the basketball team, and he said, every day in the locker room, someone says something offensive. And sometimes I speak up, but sometimes I don't. And so here's the challenge. You have to address for yourself, how do you feel, speaking up or not speaking up? That's absolutely your call. And I'm certainly not here to tell anybody what they should do. What I'm here to do is to say, you have options. So you could say, that's really offensive or whatever. Or you could say, hey, I used to use that term, but I've since learned that, that some people think it's offensive. And so now I use this instead. Or you could say, I'm sure you don't mean any harm by it, but, I've actually heard that some people think, whatever. So it's also an opportunity to educate somebody. There are times in which people say things that they don't understand or offensive or problematic. And I think the challenge is when we don't call out behavior, it conveys to other people that there's support. So again, there's no right answer. But I think what's important is that we all have choices. We all have choices. And as Steve Sharma, I think, is saying, you need training in how to speak up, how to say something in a nice but determined way. And the words we speak as to not offend, but get your point across. And yeah, I think that's a great example, because that's an example in which overwhelmingly, it's really, really important to be able to call out the behavior instead of staying silent. And when you stay silent, that in fact is really implying that you agree with it. And that's a great example. Tess, you tell me when I've overstayed my welcome. Catherine Hayes has said, maybe talk about the personal upside of speaking up. And I think I just lost that one because it went by very fast. The personal upside of speaking up and making a difference, even when you may or may not be successful, that overcome the fear and encourage the courage. That's a really great point. And what I'll say about that is that I think there's two things. Sometimes you actually educate that person, and that person says, oh, I guess that joke was offensive, or I guess that comment was offensive, or I guess that's not okay here. But I think the other key is that it also educates people around you. So maybe everybody is also thinking to you, that's really a problem, but nobody is actually saying anything. And as soon as one person says something, the other people around are like, oh, thank goodness someone says something. And I've been repeatedly at meetings at which I will say something, nobody supports me at all. And then later on, people will say, I really appreciated you saying that, or thanks for speaking up. And so I think there are lots of times in which we feel something, and when other people stay silent, we can feel more comfortable by speaking up, knowing that they may be staying silent because they don't want to feel silly or offend, just like we are having that same impulse. And so I think that's a great example. And thanks for sharing that.